There are things this world does to women it cannot understand. And one of the cruelest is this. It takes a woman built for survival, broad-shouldered and unbreakable, scarred by the very hands that should have sheltered her, and it calls her worthless. Abigail Rose Turner had carried that verdict for 26 years, until the day a silent stranger stepped out of the silver fog of Silverpine Ridge, and without a single word of pity offered her something far more dangerous than charity. He offered her a purpose, and in doing so he cracked open the door to a life she had long since stopped believing she deserved. Stay with us until the very end of this story. Drop a comment below and tell us what city you are watching from. This one is going to change something in you. The forest did not ask questions. That was the first thing Abigail Rose Turner had come to love about it years ago, when love itself had become a word she handled the way you handle broken glass, carefully with great distance. And never for long. The trees of Silverpine Ridge did not look at her face and flinch. The creek that ran cold and fast through the northern hollow did not lower its eyes when she knelt to drink from it. The ravens that nested in the old-growth Douglas fir near her camp watched her with those flat, intelligent eyes of theirs, and if they found anything remarkable about her appearance, they kept the opinion to themselves. The forest, in short, had better manners than any human settlement she had ever known, and so the forest was where she stayed. She had been out here for 3 years now. 3 years of learning the language of roots and rainfall, of moss and migration, of the particular quality of silence that descends over a high mountain wilderness in the deepest hour before dawn. 3 years of building a life from almost nothing with these two broad hands and this stubborn, enduring body that the world had always seen as a liability, and that she had slowly, painfully come to understand as her single greatest asset. She rose before the light. She foraged when the dew was still heavy on the fern fronds and the wild ginger. She processed her harvests by firelight drying and bundling and distilling with a methodical patience that bordered on devotion. She patched her shelter, reinforced her stores, tracked the weather by the color of the evening sky and the behavior of the pine squirrels. She survived. Every single day, in ways large and small, she survived. And she did it entirely alone. She was 26 years old. She stood 5 feet 10 inches tall, and her frame was what the old-timers in the valley below might have called formidable, a word that carried in it both respect and a slight wariness, as though the speaker was not entirely sure which side of the line you fell on. She was powerfully built, broad across the shoulders, with arms that had grown genuinely strong from 3 years of hauling water and splitting wood and dragging fallen timber back to camp. Her hands were calloused and capable. Her dark hair she kept braided and pinned out of her way, a purely practical arrangement. And across her left cheek, running from just beneath her eye to the corner of her jaw, was the scar. It was an old scar, now smooth and pale against her olive skin, faded to the color of winter birch bark. It had long since stopped hurting in any physical sense. The pain it carried now was of a different order entirely, the kind that lives not in the flesh, but in the memory, in the specific terrible recollection of how it had come to be there. She had been 14 years old. Her father, Raymond Turner, had come home from the Copper Ridge Tavern in the particular state that the family had learned over many years of grim education to recognize and fear. Not the loud, sloppy drunk, the one who sang off-key and wept over old grievances and could sometimes be redirected to the couch with a glass of water and a careful word. That version of Raymond was manageable. No, this was the other drunk, the quiet one, the one who moved through the house with a slow, deliberate heaviness, who found fault in everything and everyone who was looking, always looking for something to punish. Abigail had been in the kitchen when he found her. She had been too slow to move, too startled to run, and the consequence of that slowness lived on her face every day of her life. The scar had been in many ways the beginning of the end of her life in the valley. Before it, she had been merely inconvenient to her family, too large, too serious, too unlike her prettier and more tractable younger sister. After it, she became something worse. She became a source of shame. Her mother, a gentle but profoundly defeated woman named Helen, had taken her to the county clinic in the city and then brought her home and never spoken of it again. Her father, when sober, exhibited no remorse that Abigail could identify, only a kind of irritable discomfort in her presence, as though her scarred face was an accusation he resented having to look at. Her schoolmates, with the precision cruelty of adolescence, ensured that she understood clearly and in detail exactly how her appearance deviated from the acceptable. Exactly how far outside the circle of normal girlhood she now lived. She had finished high school. She had worked at a feed store, then at a cannery, then doing seasonal agricultural labor, always at the margins of things, always the one people looked past rather than at. She had sent money home to her mother for 2 years because her mother, for all her failures, had also bandaged Abigail's wounds when Raymond was not looking and left library books outside her bedroom door. When her mother died, Abigail stopped going home at all. And when Raymond, emboldened by grief, or perhaps simply by habit, showed up at the small apartment she was renting on the edge of town and told her, standing in her doorway with his hat in his hands and a smell of stale beer about him, that she was a disgrace to the family name, and that her sister was getting married to a respectable man, and that it would be best if Abigail made herself scarce. So as not to embarrass everyone, she had looked at him for a long, level moment. She had not wept. She had learned a long time ago not to weep where he could see it. She had said very quietly, "I have been making myself scarce for you my entire life, Raymond. This time, I am going to do it properly." She had packed what she could carry. She had driven east and then north and then east again until the highway became a 2-lane road, and the 2-lane road became a gravel track, and the gravel track petered out entirely at the foot of a ridgeline, dense with old pines and heavy fog. She had looked up at those trees and felt for the first time in years something loosen in her chest. Not happiness exactly, something quieter and more durable than happiness. Something that felt cautiously like the possibility of peace. That had been 3 years ago. Now she moved through the early morning forest with the practiced ease of someone who has walked the same paths in the dark enough times that her feet know the route without her mind's instruction. The air was cold, carrying the metallic promise of a hard season ahead. The aspens had turned weeks ago, and most of their leaves were down now, plastered wet and gold against the dark earth. The conifers held their color, as they always did, somber and permanent above the deciduous loss. She carried a wide woven basket on her back, a canvas bag over one shoulder, and she moved with her head slightly down, and her shawl pulled forward out of long habit, the habit of not wanting to be seen. Her harvest route that morning took her along the eastern slope, where the late-season mushrooms still emerged from the damp soil in clusters, lion's mane oyster, the occasional hen of the woods. She gathered methodically, cutting rather than pulling, leaving the mycelium intact, thinking ahead to the drying racks back at camp. She needed to process the last of the elderberry before the freeze. She had yarrow still to bundle and a new batch of plantain salve to render from the infused oil she had set aside 2 weeks ago. The work was never finished, but that was the nature of it, and she had made her peace with that a long time ago. She almost missed the bundle. It was wedged into the fork of a hemlock at the edge of the game trail, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth and secured with a bit of cord. She stopped when she saw it, her body going very still in the automatic way it always did when something in her environment was unexpected. She stood for a moment watching the trail in both directions, listening to the forest. Nothing moved except the distant complaint of a Steller's jay. She set down her basket, approached the bundle carefully, and unwrapped it. Inside the oilcloth was a dead snowshoe hare, already field-dressed and cleaned, along with a small folded square of brown paper. She unfolded the paper and read the words written there in a large, careful hand, the hand of someone who wrote infrequently, but took care when they did. For the woman who left the salve at Pine Marker 7, "My knee is better. Thank you." She stared at the note for a long time. Then she folded it again and tucked it into her coat pocket. She took the hare. She left no response because there was nothing she wanted to say, and because any response would be an invitation, and invitations were things she had stopped issuing years ago. But that night, eating a stew made rich with the hare, and the last of her dried summer vegetables, she found the note still in her pocket, and read it again by firelight. She did not know why she did not burn it with the evening's kindling. She simply folded it back up and returned it to her pocket and went to sleep. The salve the note had referenced was one of several she had left at various points in the forest over the past 2 years, always under cover of dark or early morning. Always in places where she had observed signs of human traffic, hunters' camps, logging roads, the occasional trapper's line. She left them not out of any desire for connection. She was honest with herself about that, but because her knowledge was too useful to waste and her conscience too intact to ignore visible suffering. She had found a deer hunter 3 months ago collapsed on the trail with a badly sprained ankle, unable to walk. She had splinted the ankle with material from her kit, told him in brief, precise terms how to use the pain reduction herbs she left with him, and disappeared before he could see her face, clearly enough to describe. She had brought anti-inflammatory poultices to a logging crew dealing with an outbreak of contact dermatitis. She had left fever-reducing tea at a camp where she had heard a child coughing in the night. She wanted no acknowledgement. She wanted no gratitude. She especially wanted no conversation, no concerned eyes, no clumsy attempts at kindness that would curl back into pity, or worse, the particular species of fascination that her scarred face sometimes generated in strangers that barely concealed hunger to know the story behind it. The forest grapevine was apparently more active than she had realized because people had begun leaving things for her in return food, mostly the occasional piece of useful equipment. She took what she needed and left the rest. It was a life. It was a quiet life and a hard one, and it was entirely hers. And those last 3 words made it precious beyond calculation. The weeks moved on. The temperature dropped with increasing seriousness. The fog that gave Silverpine Ridge its name thickened, rolling in from the higher elevations each afternoon and settling low and dense over the hollows and creek beds, muffling sound, blurring distances, making the familiar landscape into something slightly dreamlike. She liked the fog. It was another layer of privacy, another buffer between herself and a world she had learned through long experience not to trust. She was reinforcing the eastern wall of her shelter on a Thursday afternoon, the fog so heavy she could barely see 20 feet when she heard the footsteps. She heard them long before she saw anything, which was characteristic of how Abigail moved through the world. Her senses perpetually tuned to the frequency of approach. Her body always quietly oriented toward the nearest exit. The footsteps were deliberate, unhurried, moving through the underbrush with more care than a casual walker, but less stealth than a hunter trying to conceal himself. Someone who was comfortable in the forest but was choosing not to hide his approach. Someone who understood that appearing without warning on a solitary woman's doorstep would be at best unwelcome. She set down the timber brace she had been holding and straightened her shawl, already pulled forward, her hands still. She waited. He emerged from the fog like something the ridge itself had produced, tall, heavy-set, in the way of a man who had spent his life doing physical work, wearing canvas work clothes and boots that had seen serious use. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, a beard trimmed close, and the kind of face that belongs to men who spend a great deal of time outdoors, weathered and direct with the particular quality of expression that comes from years of saying what you mean and having learned that extra words rarely help. He stopped at what she would have called a respectful distance, perhaps 12 feet in the clearing before her shelter. He did not stare at her. He looked at her the way you might look at another person in an ordinary context, briefly neutrally taking in information without editorializing. "Miss Turner," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. She did not answer immediately. Her body was very still, but internally she was conducting a rapid assessment height billed the absence of any visible weapon. Though she was under no illusion that meant he was unarmed, the position of his hands, which were open and visible, the quality of his posture, which was not aggressive. She had become very good at this kind of reading over the years. It was how she had stayed safe. "You have a name," she said. It was not quite a question. "Elijah Mercer," he said. "I run a camp about 3 miles northeast up on the second bench. I have been up here going on 11 years. She knew the camp vaguely. She had seen smoke from that direction in winter, had observed the careful, minimal footprint of someone who knew how to live in a forest without destroying it. She had noted with professional interest the quality of his trap lines set with skill and maintained with consistency in places that showed real knowledge of animal behavior. She had never had occasion to think much further about him than that. "What do you want, Mr. Mercer?" she asked. "To talk to you," he said, "if you are willing." "About what?" He was quiet for a moment. Not an uncomfortable quiet, not the quiet of someone searching for words because they have not thought this through, but the quiet of someone who has decided what to say and is organizing it before speaking. She found, to her slight surprise, that she did not feel an immediate urge to end this encounter. She was watching him with the same steady attention she gave to any new element in her environment. "I have watched you work," he said finally, "from a distance. I am not saying that to unsettle you. I am saying it because you deserve to know, and because I want to be honest with you from the first word. I have seen what you do out here. The quality of your camp, your harvests, the things you leave for people. You are one of the most capable individuals I have come across in 11 years on this mountain." She said nothing. She was waiting for what came after. "Winter is coming in hard this year," he said. "The signs have been clear since August. By December, this ridge will see temperatures and snowfall that would challenge a well-supplied camp. Your shelter?" He glanced at it briefly, and without judgment, "is not built for what is coming. My shelter is my business," she said, and her voice was even, but the words had an edge in them that she did not bother to conceal. "It is," he agreed readily and without any sign of backing down. "Which is why I am not here to tell you what to do with it. I am here to make you a business proposition." She looked at him steadily. "Go on." "I have a fully fortified camp. 2 main structures built from timber I felled and notched myself. A root cellar, a smokehouse, 4 years of winter prep behind me. What I do not have is the level of medicinal knowledge you carry. I know basic first aid and plant identification, but what you do with herbs and roots and compounds, that is a different order of expertise entirely. I have a recurring joint problem in my left knee that has not responded to anything I have tried. I have a mule with a chest condition I cannot diagnose, and I am behind on my winter stores processing because a mid-season injury set me back 6 weeks. He paused. I am proposing a winter agreement, he said. You come to my camp. You bring your skills and your labor. In exchange, you have warm shelter, reliable food, and no interference in your personal life whatsoever. A straight exchange. Work for shelter. No charity, no pity, no obligation beyond what we agree on. The silence that followed was long. Fog moved through it like slow water. She was thinking. She was very good at thinking without showing it, a skill she had developed early out of simple self-preservation, because showing your thought process was showing your vulnerabilities, and she had learned young that vulnerabilities were things other people used. She thought about the shelter wall she had been reinforcing when he arrived. She thought about the places she had already identified where the cold would get in the gaps. She had not yet solved the problem of the drainage on the north side that she had been putting off because she was running low on the right materials. She thought about the temperatures he had described, and she thought about her own body heat, limits her supply of dry firewood, the insulation she did not quite have enough of. She had been a survivor for 3 years. She knew what survival actually required, which meant she could not afford to let pride cost her her life. She thought about him, his open hands, the absence of staring. "No interference," she said. "In my personal life." "You mean that?" "I mean it," he said. "I set my own schedule. I keep my own quarters." "Agreed. And when spring comes, this arrangement ends on my terms, not yours." He nodded. "That seems fair." She looked at him for another long moment. He met her gaze without effort, and without that thing she had learned to recognize and hate, that particular combination of curiosity and discomfort that most people's faces produced when they found themselves looking directly at her scar. He simply looked at her the way you look at a person you are in a conversation with, attending to what she was saying rather than to the fact of her face. "I will need a day to break down my camp and gather my stores," she said. "I will meet you at Pine Marker 7 at first light the day after tomorrow," he said, "with the mule to help carry." He nodded once, turned, and walked back into the fog. Within seconds, the trees had swallowed him completely, as though he had never been there at all. She stood in the clearing for a moment after he was gone. The forest was very quiet. Somewhere above the fog layer, the sky was beginning to go the deep, bruised purple of early evening. She could feel the cold settling in with the darkness moving up from the ground, filling the hollow spaces of the air. She went back to reinforcing the shelter wall. She would finish the job because it was already started, and she did not leave things half done. But her mind was moving ahead to the day after tomorrow, to Pine Marker 7, to the 2 miles of Foggy Ridge Trail between where she stood and a fortified cabin where the cold would not get in. She had spent 3 years building a life that required nothing from anyone. She told herself that accepting this arrangement was merely a rational extension of that same self-reliance. A strategic decision. A matter of survival math, plain and simple. She almost believed it. She worked until the light was fully gone. Then she banked her fire, rolled out her bedding, and lay in the darkness listening to the wind begin to move through the canopy above, carrying in it the distant, serious smell of the winter that was coming. She put her hand in her coat pocket and found the note there, the one from the hare. She did not take it out. She simply let her fingers rest on the folded square of paper, and after a while, she fell asleep. In the morning, she began to pack. She was methodical about it, as she was methodical about everything moving through her camp, with a practitioner's eye, sorting what was worth transporting from what could be left or cached. Her medicinal stores were the priority. The dried and bundled herbs, the tinctures in their dark glass bottles, the rendered salves, the seeds she had collected for spring planting, the reference materials she had accumulated over 3 years of self-education, a dog-eared herbal, a wilderness medicine guide, a spiral notebook filled with her own observations and formulations in small, dense handwriting. She packed her tools next the good knife, the harvesting basket, the clay pots for rendering. Her personal effects were few, and she had no attachment to any of them beyond their utility. By midday, the camp was broken down to its bones. By late afternoon, she had cached what she could not carry in a waterproof location she had prepared earlier in the year for exactly this kind of contingency, because she had learned to plan for contingencies the way other people plan for good weather as the less likely but more important scenario. She stood in the cleared space where her shelter had been looking at the bare ground, the ring of stones that had been her fire. 3 years of effort dismantled in an afternoon. She felt nothing dramatic about it. She had not allowed herself to become attached to the structures. What she had built here was knowledge and resilience, and a deep, detailed understanding of this ridge and its seasons, and those things were hers in a way that no flood or fire or drunken father could take, because they lived in her body and her mind, and not in any physical thing. She spent the night at her cache site, rolled in her sleeping blankets under a natural rock overhang that kept the worst of the damp off, listening to the forest settle into its nighttime rhythms around her. She woke at 4 a.m, as she always did, completely and without confusion. She ate what she had on hand, drank cold water from her flask, shouldered her main pack, and began walking north. She arrived at Pine Marker 7 as the fog was beginning its slow morning withdrawal from the hollow, pulling back up the slopes to reveal the frost-white grass and the ice-edged stones of the creek. She set her pack down and waited, her shawl pulled forward, her breath making small clouds in the cold air. He was there 10 minutes later, appearing from the north trail with a sturdy mule and a simple nod that served as his entire greeting. He looked at her pack without expression. He reached for it. She let him take it without comment, which was a more significant concession than it would have appeared to anyone who had not spent 3 years refusing every offer of assistance that came her way. They walked north together through the silver morning fog, and the forest folded around them, and the silence between them was the kind that does not require filling. She did not know what was coming. She did not know that this man and this silence and this foggy mountain would in the months ahead become the architecture of the most important story of her life. She did not know any of that yet, but she walked forward anyway, because that was what she had always done, and sometimes walking forward is enough. The camp was everything she had calculated it would be, and nothing she had allowed herself to imagine. She had kept her expectations deliberately low during the 2-mile walk north, the same way she kept her expectations low about most things as a form of self-protection, a preemptive management of disappointment. She had told herself it would be adequate, dry probably, functional certainly, given what she had observed of his trap lines and his smoke patterns over the past 3 years. Adequate was what she had bargained for, and adequate was what she had prepared herself to receive. What she found instead was craftsmanship. The main cabin sat on the second bench of the ridge, positioned with deliberate intelligence against a granite outcrop that served as a natural windbreak on the north and west sides. The logs were notched and fitted with a precision that spoke of someone who had taken real time with the work, who had understood that in a mountain winter the quality of your construction is not an aesthetic matter, but a survival one. The chinking between the logs was solid and even. The roof had a steep pitch and generous overhang designed to shed heavy snow loads. A covered woodshed ran along the eastern wall, stacked to the rafters with split timber, the rounds, seasoned and dry, organized by size, with the methodical logic of a person who thinks ahead as a matter of instinct rather than effort. There was a second smaller structure 20 feet from the main cabin, a combination smokehouse and processing shed, its interior strung with drying lines and fitted with the kind of low, broad work surfaces that told her immediately that the person who had built it actually used it. Understood the ergonomics of processing work, had thought about where your back would hurt after 4 hours of standing at a table. There was a root cellar dug into the slope behind the cabin, its door fitted with a heavy wooden latch, and banked on the outside with earth and pine needles for insulation. A cistern system, fed by a diverted trickle of snowmelt from the granite face above, gave them running water by gravity alone, cold and clean and constant. She stood in the clearing between the structures and took it all in for a moment, her pack still on her back, her expression giving nothing away. Elijah had brought the mule around to the woodshed and was unloading with quiet efficiency, not watching her, not waiting for her reaction, simply doing the next thing that needed doing. The small room off the back of the main cabin, he said, his back to her, lifting her medicinal kit from the mule's pack frame with careful hands. I put a wood stove in there last winter. It has its own door to the outside. The latch is on the inside. She understood what he was telling her. It was her space. It had a lock she controlled. He had thought about this before she arrived. "Thank you," she said. The words felt unfamiliar in her mouth, not because she was ungrateful, but because she had not said them to another person in a long time, and they required a kind of opening she was not used to making. He nodded once the same economical nod he had given her at Pine Marker 7 and carried her kit toward the cabin. She followed. The small room was perhaps 10 feet by 12, with a single window facing east, and the small iron stove in the corner he had described. There was a rope bed frame with a decent mattress of ticking stuffed with what smelled like pine needles and dried grass. A simple table, a shelf along one wall. It was bare and plain and entirely hers, and she stood in it for a moment after he had set her things down and left, closing the main cabin door behind him, and she breathed the smell of the wood and the cold and the faint mineral scent of the mountain outside the window. She unpacked her medicinal stores first, because they were the priority, arranging the bottles and bundles on the shelf with the same systematic logic she used for everything grouped by function labeled in her own hand. Then she unpacked her personal effects, which took considerably less time. She made the bed with the efficiency of someone who has performed the action 10,000 times without thinking about it. She set her notebook on the table and her knife on the shelf edge where she could reach it from the bed. Then she sat on the edge of the mattress and allowed herself 30 seconds of complete stillness, which was her version of what other people might call taking a breath. After 30 seconds, she got up and went to find out what needed to be done. Elijah was at the workbench in the processing shed, working through a pile of dried root vegetables that had not yet been sorted for winter storage. He did not look up when she came in, but he shifted slightly to make room at the bench, a wordless invitation that she accepted by picking up a root and beginning to sort. They worked in silence for an hour. It was not the silence of two people who have nothing to say to each other. It was the silence of two people who are both comfortable enough with themselves that they do not need to fill space with noise. After an hour he said, "The mule. Her name is Dorothea. She has been coughing for 3 weeks, worse in the mornings. Bring her to the shed tomorrow morning," Abigail said, "before you feed her." He nodded. They went back to sorting. That evening he cooked a simple thing, a venison stew with dried mushrooms and the last of the season's hardy root vegetables, and he put a bowl on the table for her without ceremony or comment. She sat across from him and ate, and the stew was better than she expected, seasoned with something she identified after a moment as dried juniper berry and wild thyme, foraged not bought, which told her something additional about him that she filed away without comment. "You have been on this mountain 11 years, she said. "Yes." "Before that?" He was quiet for a moment. "Army, then construction, then a series of events I do not find particularly useful to revisit." She understood that answer completely. It was almost exactly the answer she would have given about her own history, minus the army and the construction. "Fair enough," she said, and went back to her stew. He looked at her, then briefly, and something in his expression shifted in a way she did not quite have language for, something like recognition or perhaps relief. As though he had been expecting a different response, and this one had surprised him pleasantly. Then he looked back at his bowl, and the moment passed. She helped clear the table afterward, washed her own bowl in the basin, and went to her room. She lay in the darkness and listened to the mountain outside, and felt carefully, and from a great distance, the strangeness of being warm. Not just physically warm, though, that alone was significant enough after 3 years of increasingly inadequate shelter. But warm in some other more complicated sense that she did not want to examine too closely yet, because the things you examine too closely have a tendency to change once the light hits them, and she was not ready for whatever change that examination might produce. She slept better than she had in years, and she woke before 4, as always, and lay for a moment in the darkness, listening to the silence, and noting that it felt different here than it had at her old camp fuller, somehow less empty. Then she got up and lit the stove and started her day. The rhythm of the camp established itself over the following 2 weeks with a naturalness that she found both reassuring and, in her more honest moments, slightly unnerving. They rose early, both of them, she slightly before him, and began their respective tasks with a minimum of discussion, because they had already, in those first few days, developed an efficient shorthand for the division of labor. He was stronger on the large structural work, the wood hauling, the heavy repairs, the trap maintenance. She was faster and more skilled at the processing work, the drying and sorting and preserving, and she brought to that work a knowledge of medicinal preparation that expanded the camp's capabilities considerably. Within a week, the processing shed had been reorganized to accommodate her workflow, and the reorganization had made them both more efficient. Dorothea the mule she diagnosed on the second morning. A respiratory condition not serious at this stage, but requiring management particularly through the winter. She prepared an herbal steam treatment using eucalyptus she had carried with her. And wild mullein she identified along the eastern slope, and she showed Elijah how to administer it. He paid close attention, asked precise questions, retained what she told him. He was not a man who needed to be told anything twice. "She is responding," he reported after 5 days. "She will continue to as long as we maintain the treatment," Abigail said. "Twice a week through the winter, more often if the cold sharpens." His knee she addressed in the second week. He had mentioned it in his proposal, and she had noted it, but said nothing, waiting until she had observed the problem directly, watching him move through the camp with the slightly compensated gait of someone managing chronic pain without acknowledging it. One evening she set her notebook on the table and said, "Your knee. Left one. Sit down." He sat without argument. She examined it with careful professional hands, asking specific questions about the nature and timing of the pain, the history of the injury, what had and had not helped. He answered with the same directness he brought to everything, no minimizing, no false stoicism, in the face of her questions, simply accurate information delivered plainly. She prepared a compound treatment, a poultice of comfrey and arnica for topical application, a tincture of turmeric and willow bark for systemic inflammation, and a stretching protocol she had developed from her own reading that addressed the specific muscle imbalances she had identified. "This will take 6 weeks to show full effect," she said. "You need to do the stretching protocol every morning, not occasionally, every morning." "Understood," he said. "You have been compensating in your gait," she said. "It is putting strain on your right hip. If you do not correct it, you will have a second problem in another year." He looked at her steadily. "You picked that up from watching me walk?" "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "I have paid medical professionals significant sums of money over the years," he said. Who did not notice that? She picked up her notebook and did not comment, because accepting compliments was another skill she had let atrophy from disuse. But she heard it. She placed it somewhere carefully, the way you place something fragile in a specific location so you can find it again later. The days shortened. The fog came earlier and stayed later. The temperature dropped in earnest, not the polite preliminary drops of early autumn, but the serious, sustained cold of a mountain winter, settling in for the duration, the kind of cold that has intention behind it, that means to stay. Ice formed each night on the water in the cistern pipe and had to be cleared each morning. Frost appeared on the inside of the processing shed windows. The wind, when it came down off the high granite, had an edge to it that could strip the warmth from an exposed face in minutes. They were ready for it. That was what she came to understand in those weeks of work and silence and shared purpose. They were ready for it in a way that neither of them would have been alone, he, with his structural knowledge and her medicinal expertise, and both of them with a capacity for sustained, unglamorous work that was perhaps the deepest thing they held in common. It was during the third week that he taught her to read the weather. She had her own weather reading skills developed over 3 years of close observation, but his were of a different order, built from a decade of watching this specific ridge, with this specific orientation from learning the particular behavioral signatures of the local wildlife in advance of weather events. He showed her how the ravens congregated in a specific valley conifer stand about 18 hours before a major snow system moved in. He showed her the quality of light in the western sky that preceded a freeze. He explained the relationship between the behavior of the snowshoe hares and the depth and timing of the coming winter storms. A relationship he had documented over years of careful observation and that he described with the understated precision of someone reporting data. She listened with genuine absorption. She asked good questions. He noticed the quality of her questions and answered them seriously without the faintly patronizing elaboration she had learned to expect from people who were surprised to find that she was paying close attention. One afternoon, he took her along his primary trapline, ostensibly to show her a specific plant she had been describing that she had not been able to locate in her usual territory, but that he knew grew along a particular section of the eastern drainage. She identified it immediately when they found it a stand of false Solomon seal, precisely what she needed for the sleep aid preparation she had been wanting to make. While she harvested, he crouched nearby, checking a trap and resetting it, and the companionable quiet between them had by that point taken on a quality she found harder to dismiss as merely functional. "You know these ridges better than most people know their own neighborhoods," she said. "I had reason to learn them," he said simply. She did not ask what reason. She understood the logic of a person finding refuge in a landscape, understood it from the inside, and she respected the privacy of his reasons, the same way he had from the first day respected the privacy of hers. They turned back toward camp as the fog began its late afternoon descent, moving together through the trees with the easy, coordinated pace of two people who have learned each other's walking rhythm without either of them planning to. "You are not what I expected," he said. She glanced at him sideways. "What did you expect?" He considered. Someone more damaged. It was a frank thing to say, and from anyone else it might have landed wrong, but she understood what he meant because she had thought the same about herself for a long time, and because he had said it in a tone that carried no pity in it, only a kind of straightforward observation, the way he noted facts about weather or terrain. "I expect I am damaged," she said. "I have just found it more useful to get on with things." "That," he said with a quiet certainty, "is not damage. That is character." She did not respond. The fog moved around them. Her hands were full of harvested plant material, and the basket on her back was heavy, and the camp was a mile away through cold, darkening air. She walked forward through all of it, and the words he had said stayed in the air behind her like the fog present surrounding, impossible to touch. That evening she sat at the work table in her room and wrote in her notebook. Not her usual clinical observations on plant behavior or medicinal formulations, but something else, something she had not written in years. She wrote about the quality of the light on the ridge in late afternoon, the specific gold of it against the dark pines. She wrote about the sound of the wind finding the gaps in the granite above the camp. She wrote 3 sentences and then stopped and looked at them for a long time. Then she closed the notebook and went to bed. The following days brought the kind of weather that was not yet the worst the mountain could do, but was making its intentions clear. The fog was almost constant now, so thick in the early mornings that you could stand at one end of the clearing and lose the far structure entirely. The temperature rarely rose above freezing even midday. Snow fell twice, not heavily, but meaningfully, dusting the camp in white that compacted underfoot into a hard, treacherous surface. They both moved across with the automatic care of experienced people. She began to notice small things, and then she noticed that she was noticing them, which was its own kind of information. She noticed that he brought in extra firewood for her stove on the mornings when the temperature had dropped particularly hard overnight, leaving it stacked by her door without comment. She noticed that when they were working in the shed and she reached for something on the upper shelf, he did not rush to help her, which she would have found condescending, but he also shifted position slightly, so the item was more accessible, which she found, after thinking about it quietly, thoughtful. She noticed that he never made her feel observed, never gave her the sensation that she was being studied or evaluated or categorized, which was a sensation she had lived with so constantly for so many years that its absence was almost disorienting. She noticed that when other trappers or hunters occasionally passed through the area and stopped at the camp's edge to trade information or goods, which happened 3 times in those first weeks, he positioned himself between them and her without appearing to do so deliberately. He handled the exchanges efficiently and moved the visitors along without ever making it look like that was what he was doing. She was not sure whether to be annoyed by this or grateful for it. She settled on neither and filed it with the other things she was noting and not yet examining. One morning she found him at the work table in the main cabin with a map spread out marking drainage lines and elevation contours, with the focused attention of someone doing practical planning rather than academic exercise. She poured herself coffee from the pot on the stove and came to stand beside him looking at the map. "You are tracking the flood risk areas," she said. He looked up. "You can read a topographic map." "I have been living alone in the mountains for 3 years," she said. "I read everything that is useful." Something moved in his expression, quick and warm and gone before she could properly identify it. "Yes," he said, "I am tracking the flood risk. The snowpack above the second drainage has been building for 2 weeks. And we had unseasonable rain last month that did not fully drain. If we get a warm system on top of that snowpack in late winter or early spring, the runoff could come fast and high." She studied the map. She traced the drainage lines with one finger, working out the flow patterns. "The camp is positioned well," she said, "above the primary floodplain, but the processing shed—" "Yes," he said, "the processing shed is lower than I would like. You should move the winter stores to the root cellar as priority, everything that cannot be replaced." He was looking at her rather than the map. "I have been thinking the same thing." "Then we should start tomorrow," she said. "Yes," he said, "we should." She straightened and took her coffee to the window and looked out at the fog-shrouded clearing. The ravens were gathered in the tall fir at the eastern edge of the camp, 7 of them more than she had seen there before. "Storm coming?" she asked. He came to stand beside her and looked at the ravens for a moment. "In about 16 hours, he said. "Mid-sized, nothing we cannot manage." She nodded. She finished her coffee. She put the cup down and went to get her coat, because if they had 16 hours before the storm and stores to move to the cellar, there was no useful reason to stand at a window. She did not think about the way he had said "we." She did not think about the easy, unexamined naturalness of it, the way it had required no negotiation, no qualification, no clarification of terms. We. As though it had always been true. She did not think about it. But her body did something very quietly in the space behind her ribs. Something small and cautious and unmistakable, like a door that has been shut a very long time, finding in some hidden spring deep in its frame that it still knows how to open. The storm Elijah had predicted arrived in the night as promised and was gone by the following afternoon, leaving behind 8 inches of heavy, wet snow and a quality of silence so complete it felt almost physical, as though the mountain had pressed a hand over its own mouth. They moved through the aftermath of it together, clearing the paths between structures, reinforcing the snow load on the shed roof, checking the drainage around the root cellar entrance. They worked without discussing the division of tasks, because by then the division of tasks had become something they simply knew the way. You know the layout of a room you have lived in long enough that you can navigate it in the dark. That was the thing she kept returning to in the quiet of her room at night, in the space behind her ribs where the small, cautious thing had taken up residence without asking permission. The knowing. The way the two of them had settled into a shared understanding of the camp and its needs without ever sitting down to negotiate it, without ever having the kind of labored, self-conscious conversation about roles and responsibilities that she imagined most people would have required. It had simply happened the way weather happens, the way seasons turn, according to its own logic and on its own schedule, indifferent to whether you were ready for it or not. She was not sure she was ready for it. She was not sure it mattered. December arrived with a seriousness that the previous weeks had only suggested. The temperature dropped to levels that made the cold of November feel in retrospect almost gentle. The fog came and did not leave settling into the hollows and staying there day and night, so that the camp existed in a kind of perpetual silver twilight, even at midday, the trees at the edge of the clearing standing like dark, half-dissolved shapes at the boundary of the visible world. The snowpack deepened. The creek below the camp went quiet under ice. The ravens, those reliable weather prophets, clustered in their fir tree and watched everything with their flat, intelligent eyes and said nothing useful to anyone. Inside the camp, everything was different. The main cabin held heat with the tenacious efficiency of good construction. The iron stove in the central room radiating a warmth that reached into the corners and stayed there even in the hardest overnight cold. The root cellar was full. The woodshed was full. The processing shed held the organized results of 2 months of sustained work, the dried and labeled and carefully stored products of their combined labor, enough to see them through to spring with margin to spare. She had never in 3 years on this mountain gone into deep winter this well prepared. The knowledge of it sat in her chest like ballast, steady and grounding. She found herself in those long, dark evenings doing something she had not done in years. She found herself talking. Not the brief, functional exchanges that had characterized their first weeks, the short, precise sentences about mule treatments and weather patterns and store rotations. Something else, something that began one evening when they were both at the table after supper, she with her notebook and he with a piece of harness leather he was mending, and he asked her without preamble or particular emphasis how she had come to know what she knew about plants. She had started to give him the short version. The version she carried for general use, compressed and unrevealing, which was, I taught myself. But something about the quality of his attention, the way he had set down the harness leather and was simply waiting, not with the hungry curiosity of someone collecting information, but with the patient openness of someone who genuinely wanted to understand, made the short version feel insufficient in a way it never had before. So she gave him more. She told him about the library, about the county library in the town where she had grown up, which had been the one place in her childhood where the terms of her existence were temporarily suspended, where nobody cared what she looked like, or whose daughter she was, or how much space she took up. She had discovered the natural history section when she was 11, and she had worked through it systematically over the following years, not because anyone told her to, but because the information in those books was the first information she had ever encountered that felt genuinely unconditionally useful. Plants that healed, plants that harmed. The extraordinary intricate intelligence of the natural world which operated entirely without reference to the social hierarchies and arbitrary cruelties of human communities. She had found that deeply, almost desperately comforting at 11 years old, and she found it comforting still. I started keeping notes, she said. Field observations. First, just from the books, then from actual foraging. I was doing it before I even understood that there was a name for it, that people made it a formal practice. Ethnobotany, he said. Eventually, I found that word, yes. She paused. It felt like finding out that something you had been doing, alone in the dark, was actually a real and recognized thing. that other people had found it worthwhile enough to name. He was quiet for a moment. "That is a particular kind of relief," he said, "finding out that your instincts have a legitimate name." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "that is exactly what it is." He picked up the harness leather again, and the fire shifted in the stove, and outside the fog pressed soft and close against the windows, and she realized that she had just told him something true about herself, something interior and unguarded, and that the world had not ended as a result. She sat with that for a moment carefully, the way you sit with something you are not sure of the weight of. Then she opened her notebook and went back to writing, and he went back to the harness, and the silence that returned between them was warmer than the silence that had preceded the conversation, which was itself a kind of information she was only beginning to know how to read. After that, they talked more. Not always, not every evening, because they were both people who valued silence and understood it was not something to be fixed. But the conversations came with increasing frequency, and each one revealed a new angle of the other person, a new dimension that she would not have predicted from the one before. She learned that he had grown up in eastern Tennessee in the kind of rural poverty that produces either great bitterness or great resilience, and that he had come out of it with an abundance of the latter and a clearly defined sense of what he owed the world and what he did not. She learned that he had served 2 tours overseas and come home to find that the person he had been when he left had not waited for him, that the gap between the man who had departed and the world he returned to was too wide to bridge with the tools he had available. And so he had done what he knew how to do. He had kept moving further and further from what no longer fit, until he found a place where fitting was not required. She told him about the cannery, about the particular kind of invisibility that descends on a large woman in a manual labor job, the way people see the labor and not the person performing it. She told him about her mother Helen, about the library books left outside the door, about the specific, complicated grief of losing someone whose love for you was real, but whose courage was insufficient to protect you from the one who should have been the other source of that love. She did not tell him about the scar. He did not ask. The implicit understanding between them on that subject had never been stated, and never needed to be, because he had established his position on it from the very first day by the simple act of never making it the subject of his attention. What he gave her instead every day in the accumulation of small, consistent acts that she had learned to register without allowing herself to fully interpret was something more valuable than curiosity. He gave her evidence, evidence that her knowledge was worth seeking out. He came to her with questions, real questions, not the performed interest of someone trying to make her feel useful, but the genuine inquiry of a capable person who has encountered the limits of his own expertise and is not too proud to acknowledge it. He asked about the secondary applications of the plants she was processing. He asked about the logic behind her storage and preparation methods. He engaged with her answers seriously, pushed back when he had a different perspective, integrated what she told him into his actual practice. Being taken seriously by someone who did not have to take her seriously was an experience so unfamiliar that the first few times it happened, she had not known what to do with it, had deflected or abbreviated, and he had simply waited her out with that patient steadiness of his until she came back to the subject on her own terms. Evidence that her physical capability was something to be respected rather than commented on. When she hauled timber or moved stone or spent 6 hours on her feet at the processing bench, he did not express surprise. He did not qualify it. He simply noted it with the same matter-of-fact acknowledgement he would have given to any person doing a job they were obviously competent to do. The absence of a particular kind of surprise, she discovered, could be its own powerful statement. Evidence that her presence in the space was welcome, not merely tolerated. This one was the most difficult to receive because it was also the most unfamiliar. She had spent so many years understanding herself as someone who was accommodated rather than wanted, managed rather than welcomed, that the simple daily reality of a shared space in which her presence was treated as a natural and unconflicted good required constant internal adjustment. She caught herself more than once waiting for the withdrawal, the flinch, the subtle recalibration that would signal she had overstayed her welcome, or said too much, or simply been too visibly, undeniably herself. It never came. The last week of December brought a stretch of extraordinary cold, the temperature plunging to depths that made serious work outside genuinely dangerous without proper preparation. They adapted without drama, shifting their work schedule to concentrate the outdoor tasks in the brief midday window when the temperature was marginally less brutal, and spending the longer, dark hours of morning and evening on the indoor work, the processing, the equipment maintenance, the medicinal preparations she continued to develop and refine in the warmth of the main cabin. It was during one of these long indoor evenings that he taught her to play chess. She had never learned. She was not sure why she said yes when he set the board on the table between them. She suspected it was simply that saying no had begun to feel in certain contexts more effortful than it used to be. He explained the pieces with characteristic economy, one explanation per piece, clear and complete, no repetition. She paid close attention as she paid close attention to everything that was put before her, and she played her first game with the methodical intensity of someone approaching a new system, learning its internal logic, mapping its possibilities. She lost decisively and without embarrassment. She asked 2 questions about what she should have done differently. He answered them accurately. She played the second game and lost less decisively. She played the third game and won. He looked at the board for a moment after she took his king. Then he looked at her, and there was something in his expression she had not seen there before, something unguarded and luminous and entirely uncomplicated. And he said, "You are remarkable, Abigail." She did not deflect it this time. She did not abbreviate. She held the words for a moment, feeling their weight, and then she said quietly, "You are the first person who has made me believe that might be true." The fire in the stove made its small sounds. The fog outside was so thick it seemed to muffle even the wind. He did not say anything in response because there was nothing to add, and they both understood that. But he did not look away, and neither did she. And the moment between them was the kind that does not announce itself with any drama, but that you know, even as you are living it, you will carry for the rest of your life. She was the one who looked away first, back to the chessboard, resetting the pieces with hands that were steady. "Again," she said. He smiled. It was not the first time she had seen him smile, but it was the first time she had caused it directly, and the difference between those 2 things was considerable. Again, he agreed. January moved through the camp like something patient and absolute. The fog rarely lifted now. The world beyond the clearing had reduced itself to sound and suggestion, the distant percussion of a woodpecker, the creak and groan of ice-heavy branches, the occasional hollow echo of snow falling from an overloaded bough somewhere in the trees. They lived inside it, the 2 of them, and the smallness of the world they inhabited had ceased to feel like confinement and had become instead something closer to its opposite. She continued Dorothea's treatment through the cold months, and the mule's respiratory condition steadily improved. She developed a new poultice formulation for the frostbite prevention she had identified as a real risk in this level of cold, and she made sure both of them used it on exposed skin before any extended outdoor work. She completed the false Solomon seal preparation she had intended, and found it effective, adding detailed notes to her notebook about the dosage and timing. She began work on a comprehensive written guide to the medicinal plants of Silverpine Ridge, drawing on 3 years of observation and the additional knowledge she had accumulated since arriving at the camp. She worked on it in the evenings in her room, and she did not tell him about it because it felt too close to something too much like evidence of her own interior investment in this place and what it had become. He noticed anyway. He noticed most things. "You are writing more than field notes. he said one afternoon when she had the notebook open at the workbench, and he had come into the processing shed to check the drying lines. She looked up. A guide to the local medicinal flora. He was quiet, considering this. For whom, I do not know yet, she said honestly. He nodded slowly. It should exist, he said. What you know should not live only in your head. She went back to the notebook, but inside, in that space behind her ribs, something expanded slightly, something that had been holding itself carefully contained, taking up a little more room. It was in the second week of February that he began teaching her to track. She had basic tracking skills from her 3 years in the forest, enough to read fresh sign, to identify species, to understand direction of travel and approximate timing. But his were different, refined by a decade of patient, disciplined observation into something that was closer to reading a landscape, as a text interpreting the story it was telling in the compressed language of disturbed snow and pressed bark and the absence of expected sound. He took her out on the clear mornings when the cold had set the snow into a hard, recordable surface, and he walked her through what he was seeing with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything. She was a quick study, and he told her so without making a production of it. She had the observational habit already built, the trained attention that had come from years of close botanical work, the practice of looking past the obvious to the specific, the significant, the informative detail. She simply needed to learn to apply it to a different set of signs. She learned fast. They were out on the eastern ridge on a morning in late February, following the track of a large tom cougar that had passed through the area 2 nights before, when she stopped at the edge of a rocky outcrop and looked out over the valley below. The fog had lifted partially that morning, an unusual event for that time of year, and the valley was briefly incompletely visible. Far below them, a patchwork of dark and gray and the white of field snow with a dim suggestion of buildings at its center. She stood and looked at it for a while without speaking. "Silverpine town," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. He had stopped beside her. He was not looking at the valley. He was looking at her profile. Her face turned toward that distant, half-visible community, her expression something he could not entirely read. "I used to pass through it sometimes," she said, "before I went fully into the forest, to get supplies." "I know the feeling," he said. She was quiet for another moment. Then she turned away from the valley back toward the ridge, back toward the direction of the camp. "It is too cold to stand still," she said. "We are losing the track." They moved forward along the eastern ridge, following the cougar's story through the snow, and behind them the valley was slowly swallowed again by the returning fog, disappearing back into the white and the gray, as though it had never been there, as though the world was only this ridge and this cold, and these two people moving through it with their eyes on the ground, reading what the mountain had written there. She did not look back. She had made a practice over the years of not looking back, and she was not about to abandon a practice that had served her this well. But that night, lying in the warmth of her room with the stove ticking softly and the fog breathing against the window, she thought about the valley. She thought about it in the dispassionate, analytical way. She tried to think about everything that carried emotional weight, examining it from a distance, understanding what it represented and what it did not. The valley was where she had come from. The valley contained a man named Raymond Turner who had marked her face and called her a burden and suggested she make herself scarce, and a sister who had married a respectable man and probably preferred not to think about her, and a community that had looked at her and found her wanting in every dimension that community had decided mattered. And then she thought about this ridge, this camp, this room. These warm walls and the sound of another person's steady breathing on the other side of them, and the chessboard on the table in the main cabin, and the notebook filling up with her own considered words, and a man who looked at her face and saw her. She pulled her blanket up. She closed her eyes. She had been surviving for years. She was beginning slowly and with great caution to understand that what was happening now was something different from survival. She did not yet have a word for it that she was willing to use, but she felt its shape, patient and warm and larger than anything she had let herself imagine, pressing quietly against the inside of her ribs like something alive, like something that had always been there, waiting for the right conditions to grow. March came in the way it sometimes does in the high country, not with the tentative softening that the word spring implies, but with a kind of violent ambivalence. Days of almost warmth, followed by nights of savage cold. The snowpack neither fully committing to melting nor agreeing to stay frozen. Existing instead in a state of suspended unstable tension that Elijah had been watching with the focused attention of someone who understood that tension of that particular kind has a breaking point. He had said nothing to alarm her. That was not his way. But she had noticed over the preceding 2 weeks the increased frequency with which he checked the drainage map, the way his eyes went to the sky at a different angle. In the mornings, the slight shift in the quality of his silence when he came back from his early checks of the eastern drainage. She had noticed, and she had catalogued it with the same patient attention she gave to everything, and she had begun her own quiet preparations without discussing them, because discussing preparations with Elijah was often unnecessary, because they had developed over these months a shared fluency in the language of practical concern. She moved the remainder of her medicinal stores to the root cellar on a Thursday morning in the first week of March. All the irreplaceable things, the tinctures representing months of work, the seed collection, the notebook with its 3 years of accumulated field knowledge, and the growing guide to Silverpine's medicinal flora. She did it methodically, making 2 trips with the loaded pack basket, and when she came back into the main cabin after the second trip, Elijah was standing at the window looking at the sky to the southwest, with an expression she had learned to read with some accuracy by then. "When?" she asked. He did not ask what she meant. "Tonight," he said. "Maybe early morning. There is a warm system moving in off the coast, fast and wet. The snowpack on the upper drainage has been sitting at critical saturation for 10 days. She was already thinking through the implications. "The processing shed." "I reinforced the foundation supports yesterday," he said. "It may not be enough." She looked around the main cabin, calculating. "Dorothea. I will move her to the upper enclosure before dark. The granite face will protect her from the worst of it." She nodded. They stood together at the window for a moment, watching the southwest sky, where the clouds were already beginning to build, in a way that confirmed what he had said, dark and fast-moving, carrying rain rather than snow at this elevation, which was the particular combination that turned an already saturated snowpack into something catastrophic. "I want my kit in the cabin tonight," she said. "Emergency kit, in case we have to move fast." "I was going to suggest the same thing," he said. They moved through the rest of the afternoon with a focused efficiency that had no panic in it, because they were both people who understood that panic is expensive and clarity is cheap, and that in a genuine emergency, the difference between the two can be the difference between surviving and not. She prepared her emergency kit with the precision of long habit, selecting for weight and critical function. The core medicinals, the wound kit, the fire-starting materials, the concentrated food. He secured the camp with the same systematic thoroughness, moving anything of value to the highest point of each structure, reinforcing what could be reinforced, letting go of what could not. They ate supper early and quietly. The wind had picked up by then, moving through the pines with a sound that was different from the usual winter sound, warmer and wetter, and carrying in it the smell of rain from lower elevations. The temperature at camp level had risen several degrees since mid-afternoon. The snowpack, she knew, was responding to that warmth in real time. Every degree of temperature increase translated directly into melt rate and runoff volume. The math was not complicated, and it was not encouraging. "You should sleep," he said, clearing the supper things. "I will take the first watch." "I will not sleep," she said, which was simply accurate rather than argumentative. He looked at her. "No," he agreed. "Neither will I, most likely." They sat at the table with the lamp between them and the storm building outside, and she got out her notebook because it gave her hands something to do, and he got out the chessboard because it gave his the same. And they sat in the lamplight while the wind grew and the rain began at first lightly, and then with increasing conviction a sound on the roof that shifted from tap to drum roll to something that was less a sound than a sustained pressure, a weight of water falling out of the sky with the concentrated intention of returning to the earth as fast as possible. She was not playing chess, not really. She was listening. She was listening to the rain and to the sounds of the camp under the rain and to the particular note that the creek below made as its volume increased, a deepening of pitch, a growing urgency in the water's voice that she had learned to interpret over months of close attention. The creek found a new register around midnight, something lower and more powerful, and she set her chess piece down and said, "The water is rising." He was already on his feet. He had heard it too. They got their coats and boots on without rushing, but without wasting time either, and he took the lantern and she took the second one, and they went out into the rain. It was immediately clear that this was beyond the range of anything she had experienced on the ridge. The rain was not falling so much as driving, coming nearly horizontal in the gusts, warm and heavy and relentless. The snow in the camp clearing was collapsing visibly, the surface she had walked across for months, dissolving under the rain with shocking speed, exposing the dark earth beneath in patches that expanded as she watched. The sound of the creek was now fully audible from the camp level, which it should not have been, which told her that the water had risen several feet already and was still rising. Elijah moved to the processing shed, first checking the foundation, his lantern swinging in the wind. She went to the root cellar to verify the seal on the door was holding, pressing her hand against the packed earth bank, feeling for water infiltration. The earth was saturated, but the cellar door was holding. She stood and turned, and held her lantern up, and tried to see the drainage slope through the curtain of rain. What she saw made her breath stop. The upper drainage had released. She could not see it in full, but she could see the consequence of it. At a dark wall of water and debris moving through the trees on the slope above the processing shed, with a sound like something tearing, like the mountain itself was being pulled apart at a seam. It was moving fast, and it was moving toward them, and there was not time, there was barely any time at all. "Elijah!" she shouted, and her voice was swallowed almost immediately by the roar of it. He heard her. She saw his lantern swing toward the slope, and then he was running toward her rather than away from the water, which registered in some part of her brain as both irrational and absolutely characteristic of him. He reached her and grabbed her arm, and they ran for the high ground behind the main cabin toward the granite face where the terrain rose sharply enough to put them above the flood path. They almost made it. She was perhaps 20 feet from the base of the granite slope when the leading edge of the floodwater hit her from behind and took her feet completely out from under her. It was not the wall of it, not the full force, but even the leading edge of a flash flood on a saturated mountain slope is a force that a human body is not designed to resist, and she went down hard, and the water was moving her before she had processed that she had fallen, pulling her sideways with a cold, impersonal power that was unlike anything she had ever felt, unlike any force she had ever encountered, because it did not care about her at all, and that indifference was itself a kind of terror. She grabbed for anything. Her hands found a root, a thick exposed root of one of the old Douglas firs, and she held it with everything she had, and the water poured over her and around her, and she held. The cold was immediate and total, and her body registered it as a shock distinct from the fear, two separate, overwhelming inputs competing for her attention. She heard him shout her name. "Here," she called back, and the word cost her effort because she was holding the root with both hands, and every muscle in her body was engaged in the single task of not being moved. He found her. She felt his hands close around her forearms above the root, and then he was pulling, bracing himself against the fir trunk, with his back using the leverage of his body weight and his considerable strength against the water, and she released the root and gripped his arms instead, and he pulled her up the slope, inch by inch, against the current, and then they were above the flood line, and he had her, and they were both on their feet, soaked and breathing hard on a narrow shelf of ground at the base of the granite face. They stood there for a moment, and breathed, and the floodwater roared past below them in the darkness, and they were alive. He did not let go of her arms. She realized after a moment that her hands were still gripping his, and that she was shaking, which she recognized as the physiological response to cold and adrenaline. And not as weakness, she understood that distinction clearly, but the shaking was beyond her control, which was itself unsettling, in a way the flood had not quite been. "Are you hurt?" he said. His voice was close because he was close. Close enough that she could see his face by the ambient light of the chaos below them, the strange illuminated quality that floodwater at night develops from its own churning motion. "No," she said. "Yes, my hands." She looked at her hands. She had torn them on the root in the first seconds of holding the bark-shredding skin from her palms in 2 ragged lines. The rain made it difficult to assess, but she could feel the sting of open wounds through the cold. "We need shelter," he said. "There is a cave, 40 feet up the granite face." "Can you climb?" "Yes," she said without hesitation, because hesitation was a luxury the mountain was not currently offering. He went first, showing her the holds, guiding her hands to the specific places in the granite where the grip was reliable and the foothold solid. She climbed behind him with the methodical focus of someone who has chosen to address one problem at a time and is refusing to consider the larger situation until the immediate one is resolved. Her torn palms screamed against the stone. She did not slow down. The cave was more accurately a deep overhang, a shelf of granite that extended perhaps 12 feet back into the rock face and 15 feet across, with enough vertical clearance to stand upright in the center. It was dry. The overhang above was deep enough that even the driving rain barely touched its back wall. It was not warm, not by any measure, but it was out of the water and out of the direct wind, and in the context of the last 15 minutes, it felt like an extraordinary gift. He had emergency supplies cached here. She was not surprised to discover this, because caching emergency supplies at reliable high points was exactly what a person with his level of practical intelligence would do, and she was grateful for it in a way that went straight past pride. He had a fire kit, waterproof, sealed, and dry tinder in an oilskin pouch. And he had her a fire going within 10 minutes, which in wet granite conditions was a genuine achievement. The small fire built against the back wall where the rock would reflect its heat was inadequate for the scale of their wetness and cold, but it was something to work toward. They were soaked through completely, both of them. And the temperature, which had risen enough to bring the rain rather than snow, was still well below anything that wet clothing could protect against. She knew what hypothermia looked like in its early stages. She was beginning to see those signs in both of them. She went to work on her hands first because she needed them functional. She wrung as much water as she could from her coat sleeve and used the relatively dry interior lining to clean the wounds as best she could, biting down against the pain because she needed her focus elsewhere. Then she opened the emergency kit she had carried out with her, and with hands that were functioning despite the cold and the injury, she dressed the lacerations efficiently. She was a better field medic than she was a patient, which was a problem, so she handled both as best she could and moved on. She was pulling off her outer coat to wring it out when the shaking intensified. She had been managing it, keeping it at the edges of her attention, but the cold was settling into her core now with the persistent certainty of something that has made up its mind. Her fingers were struggling with the coat buttons. She stopped trying to hurry. She breathed. She worked through the buttons, one at a time. Elijah was wringing out his own shirt beside the fire when he turned and saw her. He saw her hands shaking on the buttons. He saw the particular color of her lips. He crossed the space between them without any preamble. "Let me," he said quietly. "I have it," she said, and her voice came out less steady than she intended, "Abigail." He said her name the way he said everything, plainly and with complete conviction, without decoration. He put his hands over hers on the buttons, stilling the shaking for a moment simply by the warmth and steadiness of his grip. "Let me." And there it was, the thing she had been managing, the careful, necessary distance she had maintained between herself and the possibility of being genuinely helped by another person, between herself and the terrifying reality of need. She felt it rise up in her like the floodwater, that old response, that trained reflex of self-protection. She felt her body begin to pull away from his hands. "I do not need help," she said, and even as she said it, she could hear how hollow it sounded, a recording of an old conviction rather than a living truth. He did not release her hands. He did not argue with her. He did not offer sweet platitudes or careful negotiations. He simply held her shaking hands in his warm, steadying ones and looked at her directly, and what was in his face was not pity and not impatience, and not any of the things she had learned to brace herself against, but something so straightforward and so complete that it cut directly through every layer of defense she had built and found underneath them the person she had been before she had needed defenses. "You have been carrying the world alone for a very long time," he said, and his voice was quiet and certain as he was about weather and tracking and every other true thing he had ever told her. "You do not have to do it anymore, Abigail. Let me be here. Let me be your man, if only for tonight." The shaking in her hands intensified for a moment and then very slowly stopped. Not because the cold had lessened, because something else had, something old and load-bearing and exhausting beyond any physical weight she had ever carried. She felt it go with the particular devastating relief of a person who has been holding a posture so long they have forgotten it was a posture, who finally allows their body to return to its natural shape. She did not cry. She had stopped crying a very long time ago, and she did not have any particular desire to start again. But something moved through her that was of the same order as weeping, a deep, full-body shift, a releasing of something held too long in too small a space. And when it moved through her, she was still herself. She was absolutely still herself. And he was still there, holding her hands, and the fire was still burning against the granite wall. He helped her with the coat. He wrung it out, both their coats, and arranged them near the fire to dry as much as they could in the time they had. He pulled her down to sit beside the fire, and sat beside her close enough that his warmth was real and immediate, against her arm and her side, and she let that closeness exist without cataloging it or qualifying it or managing it from a distance. She sat in it. She let it be true. Outside, the flood roared on below them in the dark. They could hear the crash of debris, the deep percussion of boulders being moved by the water, the terrible sound of timber going down. The camp, she knew, was sustaining damage. The processing shed was almost certainly compromised. Some portion of what they had built together was being unmade by the water down there in the darkness. She found that she did not feel the catastrophe of it the way she would have expected. She felt it certainly, the loss of the work, the disruption of what had been a functional and deeply necessary stability. But underneath the loss was something that the loss itself could not reach, something that the water could not touch, because it did not live in any physical structure. It lived here in this cave, in the warmth between two people sitting beside a fire on a granite floor, while the mountain rearranged itself outside. She turned her head and looked at him. The firelight was doing particular things to the planes of his face, catching the gray at his temples, illuminating the steadiness in his eyes that she had come to understand was not stubbornness, but something more essential, a quality of presence that was simply constant, that did not diminish under pressure. "Elijah," she said. He turned to look at her. She did not have words for everything she meant. She was not sure she needed them. She reached out with her bandaged hand and put it against the side of his face, and he turned his face slightly into her palm, the way a man does who has been carrying his own considerable weight for a very long time, and has just been offered, for the first time, in longer than he can calculate, the extraordinary relief of being touched with genuine tenderness. What happened in that cave in the firelight and the roar of the flood belonged entirely to them. It was not dramatic in the way that the flood was dramatic. It was not loud. It was the opposite of loud. It was the sound two people make when they have found in the middle of a destruction that neither of them chose something that neither of them had known they were looking for. She had spent 26 years understanding herself as someone whose worth required constant, exhausting proof. Someone who had to earn her right to exist in any given space through the sheer relentlessness of her labor and the impenetrability of her self-sufficiency. She had built that understanding from the material she had been given from her father's fists and her mother's silence and the collective verdict of a community that had looked at her and found the wrong things. Elijah Mercer had not offered her a different verdict. He had made the verdict itself irrelevant. And in doing so, he had given her something that all 3 years of solitary survival and careful self-construction had not quite managed to provide. He had given her permission to be without qualification or proof or distance, entirely herself. She stayed awake most of that night, not from fear, but from a clarity so complete it felt like a different kind of wakefulness, entirely a state beyond ordinary alertness. She listened to the flood diminish as the hours passed, heard the water finding its new level, settling into the damage it had made. She listened to Elijah's breathing beside her, slow and even, one arm around her shoulders, his head tilted back against the granite wall. She felt the fire's warmth on her face and the solid reality of the stone beneath her and the extraordinary, unfamiliar, absolutely real sensation of not being alone. Outside, the first gray of dawn was beginning to appear at the edge of the overhang when the rain finally stopped. The silence that followed was enormous and clean, the silence of something finished, something spent. She sat in it and breathed, and the person sitting in that silence was Abigail Rose Turner, and she was unbroken, and she had always been unbroken, and now there was someone who knew that alongside her. The floodwater had receded by the time the light was strong enough to show them the camp below. She looked at what the water had done from the granite shelf, and she looked at what was still standing, and she made her assessment with the practical eye she had always brought to the truth, however it presented itself. The processing shed had partially collapsed on its lower side. Their outdoor stores were gone. The clearing was a wreckage of debris and mud and the evidence of enormous force. The main cabin built on the higher ground against the granite had held. The root cellar with everything irreplaceable inside it had held. Dorothea moved to the upper enclosure the night before was visible and apparently unharmed, watching the aftermath with the mute philosophical patience of mules everywhere. They stood side by side on the granite shelf and looked at all of it, the loss and the survival of it, and she felt him take her bandaged hand carefully in his. "We rebuild," he said. She looked at the ruined clearing, and then she looked at the cabin that had held, and the root cellar that had held, and the unbroken ridge above them, catching the first real light of a clear morning after a storm, golden and cold and absolute. "Yes," she said, "we do." They rebuilt. That was the simple fact of it, and like most simple facts, it contained within it an enormity that the words themselves could not quite hold. They rebuilt the way they did everything, without drama and without wasted motion, beginning the morning after the flood with the first light strong enough to work by and continuing until the last light made work impossible, and then beginning again the following morning. The clearing was a wreckage of mud and displaced timber and the particular kind of debris that fast water leaves behind when it has rearranged a landscape according to its own priorities. They moved through it systematically, salvaging what could be salvaged, clearing what needed to be cleared, assessing each damaged structure with clear eyes, and making decisions about repair versus replacement. With the pragmatic honesty of people who understand that sentiment about material things is a luxury that mountain life does not generally extend. The processing shed they rebuilt from the foundation up, and they rebuilt it better than it had been, siting the new foundation 6 inches higher and reinforcing the base with granite stones hauled from the slope above, the kind of correction that can only be made once you have seen exactly how a structure fails. The outdoor stores they replaced through a combination of what remained in the root cellar, which had held completely and without compromise, and a careful strategic reduction of their consumption over the weeks that followed, while the new growing season began to offer its first tentative contributions. It was tight. It required real discipline and real knowledge, the kind of knowledge she carried in her bones and in her notebook. The understanding of which plants came first in the spring, which were calorie-dense, which could be processed quickly, and which required patience. They were not hungry. They were careful, which is a different thing, and the distinction mattered to her because she had been hungry before, genuinely hungry, in the way of a person who does not know when the next meal is coming, and she understood the difference between scarcity and management. What they were doing was management, and they were doing it well, and there was a quiet satisfaction in that which existed independently of everything else that had changed between them. What had changed between them they did not immediately put into words, because neither of them was a person who needed to narrate their own life as it was happening. The change was present in every interaction, in the altered quality of the silence between them, in the way she moved through the main cabin now without the careful peripheral awareness she had maintained for months, the constant low-level monitoring of distance and position that she had kept running like a background process without fully acknowledging that she was doing it. That process had stopped. She had not decided to stop it. It had simply become unnecessary, and her body, which was smarter about some things than her conscious mind, had recognized that and let it go. He did not press her for declarations or definitions. He was not that kind of man. He showed her instead, in the continued accumulation of daily evidence that she had come to understand as his particular language, the wood he split and stacked against the lengthening spring days, because a mountain spring could reverse into winter without warning, and he was always thinking ahead. The way he handed her the first coffee of the morning without being asked, because he had learned over months of paying attention exactly how she took it and exactly what time she wanted it. The way he read her silences with an accuracy that still occasionally surprised her, knowing when they meant she needed space and when they meant she needed company, and responding to each correctly and without requiring her to tell him which was which. She watched him across the clearing one afternoon in late March, 2 weeks after the flood, as he was setting the new foundation stones for the processing shed. He was working with complete absorption, his movements precise and economical, carrying and placing the heavy granite with the focused efficiency of a man entirely at home in physical labor and entirely at home in his own body. And she felt something so clear and so complete move through her that she had to set down the seedling tray she was holding and simply stand with it for a moment. She loved him. That was the shape of the thing that had been pressing against the inside of her ribs since December, since the chess game, and the evenings, and the fog, and the shared silence of two people who have somehow, without planning it, become necessary to each other. She loved him with the particular quality of love that belongs to people who have been without it long enough to know exactly what it is and what it is not, who cannot mistake it for anything else because they have spent years in the company of its absence and know that absence intimately. She picked up the seedling tray and went back to work, because that was what you did with a true thing. You carried it, and you kept moving. That evening she told him, not with an announcement or a prepared speech, because that was not how she communicated anything that mattered. She told him the way she told him everything important plainly, and in the middle of something else while they were sitting at the table after supper with the spring dark pressing warm against the windows and the lamp burning between them. "I love you," she said. "I want you to know that. I am not saying it to ask for anything or to change the terms of anything. I am saying it because it is true, and because you have earned the right to know a true thing about me." He was quiet for a moment. The lamp flickered slightly in a draft from the stovepipe. Then he reached across the table and took her hand, the one that was still faintly scarred across the palm from the flood, and he held it the way he had held it in the cave with complete steadiness. "I have loved you," he said. "Since the morning you showed up at Pine Marker 7 with that pack on your back and looked at me like you were doing me a favor by accepting help, which for the record you were." She laughed. It came out of her unexpectedly genuine and full, and the sound of it surprised her, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it belonged to a version of herself she had not heard in so long she had half believed that version was gone. She was glad to be wrong about that. April arrived, and the mountain released into spring with the same intensity it brought to everything, the snowmelt running hard down every drainage, the ground asserting itself from beneath the receding white. The first green things pushing through the cold soil with the patient, irresistible insistence of life resuming its own business. She was in the new processing shed every morning, preparing soil for her expanded medicinal garden. Starting seedlings in the frames she and Elijah had built along the south-facing wall of the main cabin where the reflected heat from the granite would extend the growing season at both ends. She had plans for this season that she had not had before, plans that extended beyond survival into something that looked, if she let herself look at it directly, like building. She was transplanting a row of comfrey seedlings on a morning in the second week of April when she first heard the sound of someone climbing the trail from the valley below. Footsteps, more than one person moving slowly and with the effortful heaviness of people unaccustomed to the grade. She set down the seedling she was holding and straightened and listened, and something in the quality of the sound, the hesitance of it, the way it stopped and started, told her that these were not hunters or trappers or any of the occasional ridge traffic she had come to recognize. She went to find Elijah. He was already at the edge of the clearing, which meant he had heard it too, and they stood together and waited as the figures emerged from the tree line at the lower trail entrance. There were 7 of them. She recognized none of them immediately, and then she recognized all of them because they were from Silverpine town, the valley community she had watched from the eastern ridge that February morning and then turned away from. She knew their faces from her years of peripheral existence at the margins of that community, the feed store, the cannery, the road she had traveled trying to disappear. She knew who they were before she knew why they had come. She understood why they had come when she saw what they carried and what they looked like. They were carrying sick people. 2 of them were being supported between companions, barely upright, with the hollow-eyed, fever-flushed appearance of serious illness in its advanced stages. The others showed the earlier signs, feverish brightness of eye, the careful, effortful posture of people managing significant pain. They had the look of a community that has been in crisis long enough to be desperate. A woman she vaguely recognized as the owner of the general goods store in town came forward. Her face was gray with exhaustion and something else with the expression of a person who has swallowed their pride to the point of pain and is still in the process of digesting it. She stopped at a respectful distance about 20 feet from where Abigail stood, and she said, "We need help. There is a fever in the town. It started 3 weeks ago, and it has not stopped. Dr. Harmon sent to the city for medicine, but the roads have been washed out since the flood. We have lost 2 people already." Abigail said nothing immediately. She stood and looked at the group with a steady attention that was medical as much as anything else, reading what she could see from 20 feet, the presentation of the symptoms, the severity of the cases being supported, the approximate duration of illness based on their physical condition. "Who told you to come here?" she said. "Word travels," the woman said. "People on the ridge have been talking about you for years, what you know, what you have done for the hunters and the logging crews." She paused. We did not know where else to go. Elijah stood beside Abigail and said nothing, because this was her territory in every meaningful sense, and he understood that without needing to be told. She was quiet for a moment longer. She was not deciding whether to help. That decision had already been made in some part of her that operated below conscious deliberation, the part of her that had left salves at trail markers in the dark, and brought poultices to loggers, and splinted a hunter's ankle before he could see her face. Her compassion for human suffering was not contingent on the behavior of its recipients. She had known that about herself for a long time, and she had her own complicated feelings about it, but she had long since stopped fighting it, because fighting your own fundamental nature is a losing proposition. What she was deciding was the terms. "I will tell you what I assess and what I can offer," she said. "You will stay at the edge of this clearing. Nobody comes further into this camp than where you are standing now. What I give you, you take with the instructions I provide, and you follow those instructions exactly. If you cannot agree to those terms, you can go back down the mountain the way you came." The woman looked at her for a moment and then nodded. Agreed. Abigail turned to Elijah. "I need the camp table and 2 chairs brought to the edge of the clearing, and my examination kit from the processing shed." He moved immediately, and she walked toward the group, and she began her work. She examined each of them in turn, the serious cases first moving through the assessment with the clinical focus that had always been her refuge. The state in which everything unnecessary fell away, and there was only the problem and the knowledge and the space between them to be bridged. The fever was bacterial in nature. She was almost certain of it from the symptom presentation, the pattern of onset, the specific character of the inflammation she observed. A respiratory and systemic infection, the kind that moved through a crowded community in early spring when winter-weakened immune systems met the particular bacterial load that thawing soil and warming water could produce. Serious, but not in most cases unsurvivable with the right intervention. She had what she needed. Not in the quantities she would have liked. The flood had cost her a portion of her winter stores, even with the root cellar holding, but she had enough for the acute cases if she was careful about preparation and dosing. She went to the root cellar and she worked for 2 hours, Elijah beside her the whole time, assisting with the preparation, with the practiced competence of someone who had been watching her work for 6 months and had absorbed more than either of them had explicitly planned for. She prepared the treatments in careful labeled portions, writing the dosage instructions in her clear, small handwriting on folded squares of paper, tucking each set of instructions with its corresponding preparation. She made enough for 6 days of treatment for the acute cases and 3 weeks of preventive preparation for the community as a whole. She could restock from the new growing season. The first of the relevant plants were already showing. It would strain her reserves, but it would not break them. She was carrying the prepared packages to the clearing edge when she heard a voice she recognized in a way that was distinct from the general recognition of the town faces. Distinct in the way that a specific cold is distinct from general cold, targeted and personal, and carrying with it the specific weight of its history. He had come up behind the group, arriving late, moving with the careful deliberateness of a man who had been drinking or who had recently stopped the gait of Raymond Turner at 50-something years old, heavier and slower than she remembered, but recognizable in the bone in the particular set of the shoulders. He had his hat in his hands, which she also remembered, the hat-in-hands posture he adopted when he wanted to appear humble when he needed something. She stopped walking. She stood with the packages in her arms and looked at him across the clearing, and she felt the response move through her, the old trained response, the body memory of fear, and she acknowledged it, the way she acknowledged all her physiological responses now as information rather than instruction. It was there. It did not govern her. He looked at her face, at the scar she carried that he had put there, and his own face did something complicated that she did not particularly want to interpret and did not feel obligated to. "Abigail," he said. His voice was rough and reduced from what she remembered. She waited. "I am?" He started and stopped and started again. "Your sister's girl, my granddaughter. She is sick. She is 5 years old. I am asking you." She looked at him steadily. She thought about a 14-year-old girl in a kitchen, and about the library books left outside a bedroom door by a woman who did not have enough courage but had enough love to leave books, and she thought about every mile she had walked away from that valley, and every winter she had survived alone on this ridge, and every morning she had risen before the light and gotten on with the work of becoming the person she was standing here as right now. She thought about a 5-year-old girl who had not made any choices yet, and who was sick, and who was not responsible for any of the history that stood between Abigail and this clearing. She walked to the camp table and she set down the packages that were already prepared, and she picked up a separate preparation she had made with the acute pediatric cases. In mind, a gentler formulation carefully dosed for a small child's weight and tolerance. She set it on the table with its instruction paper on top. She looked at Raymond Turner, and she said in a voice that was entirely level, and carried in it no plea and no anger, and no residual hope, because she had moved past the place where any of those things had jurisdiction. "There is medicine for your granddaughter on this table. The instructions are written on the paper. Follow them exactly. On the 3rd day, if the fever has not broken, you will need to carry her to the city. Regardless of the road condition, find another way." She paused. "That is the medicine. That is all I have for you, Raymond. Everything I owe the circumstance of my birth, I am paying with what is on that table. After today, I owe you nothing, and you have no claim on me. Not my time, and not my presence, and not my name." He was quiet. He looked at the package on the table. He looked at her, and whatever was in his face, whether it was remorse or shame, or simply the plain diminishment of old age, she did not find it sufficiently interesting to examine. "Your sister would want to see you," he said, and his voice had gone quieter. "My sister," Abigail said, "can climb this mountain the same as anyone else if she decides she wants to. That is her choice to make." She looked at him for one final moment, the last time in her life she ever intended to give him her full attention. "I have made mine." She stepped back from the table. She turned toward the camp, toward the main cabin with its solid notched walls and the root cellar holding everything irreplaceable, and the new processing shed rising solid from its improved foundation, and she walked toward all of it without looking back. Elijah was standing at the cabin door. He had heard everything she knew because he was a man who paid attention, and because the clearing was not large enough to provide distance from a conversation conducted in clear voices. He looked at her as she approached, and what was in his face was something she had come to know as intimately as the topography of the ridge, that steady, undecorated certainty that was his fundamental quality, the thing in him that had made it possible for her to finally, after 26 years, put down the weight of proving herself worth keeping. She walked up the steps to the cabin door, and she stood in front of him, and he put his hands on her face. Both of them careful of the scar on her left cheek, touching it the same way he touched every other part of her face, with the same uncomplicated directness, as though it were simply a part of her and not a history and not a verdict, and not anything other than the face of the person he loved. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said, and it was true, in a way that went so far down she could not find the bottom of it. They went inside. Behind them, she heard the sounds of the valley people gathering their preparations and beginning the descent back down the mountain trail. She heard Raymond Turner's footsteps among the others, slow and diminishing, going back down toward the place she had come from, taking with them the last claim they had on her. She heard it all clearly, and she let it go just as clearly the way the mountain lets go of its snowpack in spring, not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily and completely, releasing what it no longer needs to hold, making room for what grows next. Spring came to Silverpine Ridge the way spring always came. There, not gently but with conviction, the meltwater running strong in every creek and drainage, the ground asserting its annual resurrection with the particular insistence of a landscape that has been buried for 5 months and has things to say. The medicinal garden she had planned through the winter took shape along the south-facing slope with the satisfying speed of plants in good soil in the right conditions. The comfrey came in thick and early. The elderberry bushes she had transplanted from the lower drainage showed new growth within the first warm week. The false Solomon seal she had been cultivating spread exactly as she had hoped along the shaded north side of the new processing shed. She expanded the guide she had been writing through the winter, adding the spring observations, the specific elevation and aspect notes, the preparation instructions she had refined through practice, the dosage calibrations she had worked out over 6 months of real application. The notebook had long since been supplemented by a second one, and she had begun thinking about how to organize the material into something more formal, something that could outlast any single notebook and reach further than any single clearing. Elijah read it one evening, the full extent of what she had written, sitting at the table with the lamp while she was working at the bench. He read with the focused attention he brought to everything, turning pages, slowly, occasionally going back to reread something. When he finished, he set the last notebook down and looked at her. "This needs to be published," he said. She kept working for a moment, then she set down the pestle. "I have been thinking about that." "There is a woman in the city," he said. "She runs a press that specializes in practical natural history. I came across her catalog 2 years ago. This is exactly what she publishes." She looked at him. "You have been thinking about it too." "For a while," he said without apology. She looked at the notebooks on the table, and she felt the possibility of it. The real possibility, not the cautious, distant imagining she had allowed herself in private, but the actual forward motion of a thing that could happen. Her knowledge put into form that could travel beyond this ridge and this clearing and find its way to someone who needed it the way she had needed it, some person somewhere alone in a difficult landscape, trying to figure out how to survive it. The thought of it moved through her like the first warm day of spring moves through a landscape that has been frozen for months, awakening something that had been patient and was now finally ready. "Write me the name of the press," she said. He smiled. She had stopped being surprised by how much she loved that smile, the way it moved from the corners of his eyes, first the way it was entirely unperformed. She had stopped being surprised by most of the things she felt in his company, because they had become the steady weather of her inner life rather than exceptional events. And she was grateful for that, for the way love had settled from the turbulence of its beginning into something more like bedrock, reliable and deep, and capable of holding real weight. They were married in June on the granite shelf above the camp with no ceremony beyond their own words, because neither of them had any use for performance, and with no witnesses beyond the ravens in the old-growth fir, who observed the proceedings with their customary flat intelligence, and then went back to their own business, which seemed to the two people standing on the granite to be entirely appropriate. She said, "I came to this mountain to disappear. I found instead that I had been here all along waiting to be found by someone worth being found by. You are that person, Elijah Mercer. You are the only human being who has ever looked at me and seen what was actually there. I intend to spend the rest of my life giving you reason to be glad you looked." He said, "I spent 11 years on this ridge, learning every drainage and every weather pattern and every trail. I thought I knew this mountain. Then you came up that trail from Pine Marker 7 with everything you owned on your back and looked at me like I was the one doing you a favor, and I understood that there was one more thing up here I had not yet found. I am not letting go of it. I am not letting go of you. You are Abigail Mercer of Silverpine Ridge, and I am yours. She said, "Yes, I am." Below them, the ridge fell away through its layers of pine and granite and Meltwater Creek to the valley where the fog moved in the evenings and the town went about its business. And Raymond Turner grew old with whatever he had left, and none of it had any jurisdiction here. None of it could reach this shelf of granite and this clear June light and these two people standing in it. Summer built the camp into something that expanded almost organically from what it had been before the flood, as though the flood had been a necessary clearing, a making way for what was meant to come. The new processing shed was 3 feet longer than the old one and fitted with the expanded storage and work surface that her growing operation required. She had begun accepting apprentices one at a time, for week-long stays, people who had heard through the Ridge community about the herbalist on the second bench and who came with genuine desire to learn. She taught them with the same directness she brought to everything, no condescension, no mystification, simply knowledge transferred clearly from one person to another, which was what knowledge was for. The woman from the general goods store in town came back in August alone, this time on her own feet, carrying a jar of preserved goods as a courtesy rather than a payment. She said that the fever had broken in the community within a week of the medicine reaching them. She said that Dr. Harmon had asked whether he could correspond with Abigail by letter about the treatment protocols. She did not mention Raymond Turner. Abigail did not ask. She told the woman that Dr. Harmon could write, and she would respond when she had time, which would be on her own schedule. She accepted the preserved goods with a brief nod. She showed the woman her garden because the woman had expressed genuine interest, and genuine interest was something she had always found it worthwhile to honor. They walked the rows of medicinal plants in the August afternoon light, and Abigail named them and described their applications, and the woman listened with the focused absorption of someone receiving information they have understood they will need. When the woman left, walking back down the mountain trail with the unhurried confidence of someone who had made the climb before and knew they could make it again, Abigail stood at the edge of the clearing and watched her go and felt the shape of her own life around her with a clarity that was new, not in kind, but in completeness, in the unobstructed fullness of it. She had built this. Every board of it, and every jar on every shelf, and every seedling in every row of the garden, and every word in every notebook, she had built it from the ground up, from nothing, from less than nothing, from the wreckage of a childhood that had tried to convince her she was the wreckage. She had survived alone, and she had learned to let someone in without losing herself, and she had stood on a mountain and told the man who had made her scar that his claim on her was paid and finished, and she had meant it, and it had stayed meant, and she had walked away from him and back into her own life, and her own life had been there waiting for her solid and full and real. She had not forgiven Raymond Turner. She had considered it in the careful, honest way she considered things she was not sure about, and she had come to understand that forgiveness was not the relevant category, that what she had given him in that clearing was not forgiveness, but completion, a closing of an account that had been open too long. The closing was for her, not for him. Forgiveness was something you gave to someone who had demonstrated they understood what they had done. What she had given Raymond was medicine and the end of obligation, and both of those things were right, and neither of them required anything more. She was whole, not in the sense of undamaged, because she was not undamaged, and had made her peace with that, understood it the way she understood the scar on her face as a fact of her history rather than a verdict on her worth. Whole in the sense of complete. in the sense of being fully what she was without apology or diminishment, or the exhausting work of making herself smaller so that other people were more comfortable with her presence. Elijah came out of the cabin in the late afternoon and found her at the garden edge, and came to stand beside her, his shoulder against hers, looking out over the ridge as it caught the long gold of the declining sun. The fog was beginning its nightly rise from the valleys below, moving up through the trees in its slow, silvery way, softening the hard lines of the granite and the dark shapes of the conifers, making the world beautiful in its particular inevitable manner. She put her arm through his. "I have been thinking about the press," she said. "The one you mentioned. I want to write to them this week." "I thought you might be getting there," he said. "The guide is ready," she said. "Or ready enough. It will never be fully ready, because there is always more to observe and more to add, but it is ready enough to be useful to someone, and useful is the right standard." "It is," he said. They stood in the fading light and the rising fog and the immense patient quiet of a mountain evening, and she felt the life they had made together around her and inside her, in the warmth of his arm against hers, and in the rich, productive smell of the garden, and in the solid walls of the cabin behind them, and in the notebooks full of everything she knew, and the seasons full of everything she had yet to learn. She had come to this mountain to disappear. She had found instead her own irreducible self, waiting patiently in the silence and the fog and the hard work of survival, waiting to be claimed by someone who deserved her and to claim in return a life that was equal to everything she was. Abigail Mercer of Silverpine Ridge. She was that. She was entirely and unequivocally and permanently that. And the mountain held them both, she and the man beside her, in the way it held everything it recognized as belonging to it, with the deep, indifferent, absolute embrace of wild places for the people strong enough to stay. The fog moved up through the pines. The last light caught the granite and held it for one long golden moment. Then the evening came, as it always did, and the two of them went inside, and the lamp came on in the cabin window, and on Silverpine Ridge that small warm light burned steady against the coming dark.